Thank you very much. Thank you, Nancy, for that warm introduction. It's very good to be back in San Francisco, my sometime home, and back at the World Affairs Council. As Nancy mentioned, I've just published a book called Stripping Bare the Body, Politics, Violence, War. And this is a book of stories of violence from Haiti and the violent aftermath of the fall of Jean-Claude Duvalier, leading to the aborted election in 1987, the Balkan Wars, the story of the genocide in the Balkans, and the U.S. difficulty in trying to decide what to do to stop it, and finally, the war on terror, which includes, of course, the war in Iraq, and the war, or the state of exception, I should say, that we all are still living under. By state of exception, I mean a kind of soft martial law that was imposed after September 11th, 2001, by the Bush administration, that was not unlike other states of exception in American history, beginning in 1798, with the expected war against France that never came about. A number of harsh laws were passed then. 1860, the Civil War, when Abraham Lincoln suspended habeas corpus and took other measures to deal with the rebellion. 1918-19, Woodrow Wilson took a number of measures to suppress speech against World War I. And of course, the Korematsu case during World War II, when 110,000 Japanese Americans were imprisoned in California and Arizona. And part of my thesis is that we're living under a similar state of exception, a kind of martial law, though it's never been declared, a state of emergency, state of siege. There are a number of different phrases we can use when discussing this. But each of these states of exception in American history have their own particular characteristics. Some of them have to do with habeas corpus, as with Lincoln, others with suppression of speech. This particular state of exception, though we saw warrantless wiretapping, for example, widespread arrest and detention of illegal aliens, about 5,000 after the September 11th attacks, and various other steps taken. I think the key attribute of this state of exception, which we're still living under, though the Bush administration has gone, is extreme interrogation, otherwise known as torture. And though the Bush administration has gone, we are still living with the conundrum and the conflicts and the difficulties, moral, legal, political, and otherwise, introduced into our political life by the Bush administration's decision to torture detainees. President Obama is coping with it, trying to cope with it now, and I want to talk about that a little tonight. A quick word on the book's title, because it relates to this rather directly. It's called Stripping Bare the Body, Politics, Violence, War, and that phrase comes from a quotation or a line that was said to me by a former president of Haiti named Leslie F. Moniga. He's an intellectual, a politician, who briefly became president after the aborted election in 1987. He took power from the hands of the military in what Haitians called an élection bidon, a fake election. President Moniga thought he was smart enough, clever enough, knew Haiti's history well enough, though he had come to power in this transparently undemocratic manner. He thought he could, in effect, seize real power from the military. He failed. He was overthrown in a brutal coup d'etat, which I describe in the book. But he said to me while he was in office, political violence is like stripping bare the social body. The better to place the stethoscope and track the true life beneath the skin. And I think he meant by that if you really want to understand a society, understand its political and moral conflicts, understand its inner structure, then look at it closely during a time when it's riven by conflict, by political violence. Look at it when a coup d'etat is underway, or a revolution, or sectarian warfare, or civil war, or war itself. And this book is really a string of descriptions of what Monnegat calls points of nudity. That is, points of violence which allow you to see into a society, whether that's Haiti, the Balkans, or Iraq, or I would argue, and I'm going to try to argue to you tonight, ourselves, the United States. It seems to me that our experience over the last 7+ years, since the attacks of September 11, 2001, has had the effect to strip us bare and lay before us a series of moral conflicts that, though George W. Bush is gone, we are still coping with, or trying to cope with right now. I would call it, as a group, the politics of fear. It's still with us. We're still struggling to extricate ourselves from it, as we're still struggling to extricate ourselves from the series of techniques that the Bush administration introduced and that the Obama administration is accepting in various forms, rejecting some, accepting others, as it tries to put itself on its feet when it comes to national security affairs. I'm going to talk tonight about extreme interrogation, or we could call it more simply torture. And I'd like to say this is an extremely complicated story that goes back in recent history back to 2001. It involves the military, it involves the Central Intelligence Agency, it involves the Department of Justice. It also involves us. I'm talking about the broader society, because we have known about this since at least 2004, when the photographs of Abu Ghraib were first broadcast on CBS News 60 Minutes and published in The New Yorker. I began writing about torture at that time. I published a book that fall called Torture and Truth, America, Abu Ghraib, and the War on Terror. And 2/3 of that book, 2/3 of its 650 or so pages, were actually government documents. They were documents that had been leaked from various sources, telling the story in great detail of how the government had decided to torture, how people in air-conditioned offices in Washington had worked out the legal details whereby they proved that these techniques of torture were in fact not torture and didn't violate the Convention Against Torture. And one of the things that's significant to me in this timeline, is that we're really talking about two different narratives here. One is the narrative about what happened, how the government decided what it was going to do, how the particular techniques were selected. And the other is the narrative of what we have known when we first started learning about it, and the 5-year-old story now of our own knowledge and what we have decided to do and not to do about torture. So that story is quite long and pronounced as well. Let me say a little bit. I'm going to introduce this rather complicated subject of torture by telling a story of one detainee. I should say that last spring, there came into my hands a document called the Red Cross Report on Detainees at the Black Sites. This is a document that was put together by the International Committee of the Red Cross, based in Geneva. The Red Cross, as you probably know, has, as part of its charter, the duty to interview POWs and report on how they're being treated, and in particular, whether their treatment accords with the responsibilities of states under the Geneva Conventions. The prisoner whose story I'm going to detail tonight is called Abu Zubaydah. He was captured by the United States and Pakistani forces in March of 2002, and he promptly disappeared. He disappeared into a system of black sites that the United States established, secret prisons, which were set up in Pakistan, Thailand, Afghanistan, Diego Garcia, Morocco, Romania, Poland, Lithuania. Those we know about so far. Others may come to light in the near future, perhaps, but those are the ones we know about. He had been captured in a gunfight in Pakistan. He'd been shot 3 times, stomach, the thigh, and the groin. He lost a lot of blood. He went into a coma. The CIA rushed a surgeon over from Johns Hopkins to save his life. And I'm going to start telling his story from the moment he wakes up from the coma in the spring of 2002. So he's the last he has seen. He's been in this gunfight. He thinks he's going to die, and he wakes up. I woke up naked, strapped to a bed in a very white room.